What if I told you that Brics was created by a US financial giant, Goldman Sachs? Let me explain. The name BRIC was first introduced by Jim O'Neill, then chairman of Goldman Sachs. But conspiracy theories aside, it wasn't announced as the economic alliance that would rival the G7. BRIC was a term used by O'Neill to talk about the major developing nations of the world. He wanted to introduce an umbrella term for Brazil, Russia, India, and China as the economies to watch in the next 50 years. And it wasn't anything new. Terms like these were coined in the past. One example is the so-called tiger economies that encompass the rapidly growing Asian economies of the past decades, like South Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong. But this simple term by Jim O'Neill led to the creation of BRICS after the foreign ministers of Brazil, Russia, India, and China met at a general debate of the UN Assembly in Manhattan in 2006 and decided to smash that like button, just like you should if you haven't done so already. But no, in all seriousness, they decided to begin meeting regularly, which culminated in a diplomatic meeting held on June 16, 2009 in Yekaterinburg, Russia, where BRIC was first born. In 2010, BRIC was renamed to BRICS after South Africa joined the reins. In 2024, for the first time ever, BRICS accepted new members, but more on that later. Over the years, the power of the alliance grew, and now they collectively represent 27% of the world's surface area, 25% of the world's economic output, accounted in exports, and with a population of 3.64 billion people, they represent a jaw-dropping 45.77% of the world's population. With their new members, BRICS has a combined GDP of $30.8 trillion. To grow to this extent, BRICS had to establish some official organizations that would facilitate member relations. The first goal of BRICS was to establish its own monetary fund, following the example of the IMF, called the New Development Bank. The goal of the NDB was to invest funds into developing economies, which would make them long-term partners. BRICS' New Development Bank materialized in 2015. This organization remained under the control of the BRICS members for 6 years before allowing Bangladesh, Egypt, the UAE, and Uruguay to take part in it as well. The NDB pooled $1.5 billion to connect all member countries via underwater fiber optic cable. It would be a seemingly simple task. China, India, Russia, and South Africa are relatively close together, but connecting Brazil to the same network? Now that's a problem. There are already dozens of organizations like the IMF across the world. The only difference being they're targeted at specific regions or cultural groups. The creation of these different funds is due to the controversial and biased nature of the IMF, which prefers the Western countries over anyone else. And if we look deep within the economic power of the BRICS members, we will see that they have a combined GDP of $30.8 trillion. If we take a closer look, however, we'll see that China's GDP accounts for 2/3 of the overall economic output, with a staggering $19.4 trillion. This means that the remaining 4 members and the new 6 members have a combined GDP of only $11.4 trillion. Still, despite BRICS' larger population, G7 has a combined GDP of $45.9 trillion. The one good thing about the BRICS countries is that they represent the world's largest developing economies, whereas the G7 members have economies that have matured and are lucky if they get an annual growth of around 2%. To foster better relations between the member states, they're trying to create the BRICS Games, which would be a version of the Olympic Games. The first edition of the BRICS Games was held in Goa, India in 2016. Then, the following year, Guangzhou, China hosted the second edition. And then in 2018, Johannesburg held the third edition. After a 4-year hiatus caused by a little virus known as COVID-19, the fourth edition of the 2023 BRICS Games was held in Durban, South Africa. This year's 2024 BRICS Games were held in the Russian city of Kazan, the capital of the Tatarstan Republic. The games, fully supported by the government of Russia, have a full program including 27 different sports, including athletics, gymnastics, boxing, rowing, horse racing, tennis, and so much more. The opening ceremony was held on June 12, 2024, where 4,751 athletes from 97 countries across the world fought for 387 medals for first, second, and third place. Even though the most numerous teams came from Brics members, Russia, China, and Brazil, there were also teams from smaller countries, and also athletes from Germany, the UK, Italy, France, and Spain. And while we can salute the games, the NDB, and the Brics underground cables, one thing the bloc is definitely lacking is currency power. If we look at this chart, we'll see the currency problem Brics is facing. G7 countries like Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the United States make up, are you ready for this? 91.6% of the reserve currencies in the world. The US dollar alone accounts for 59% of the reserve currencies. The euro is a close second with 19.8%, while the Japanese yen and the British pound sterling account for 5.5% and 4.9% respectively. Now, where is China on this chart? Right here, near the bottom, along with the reserve currencies of Canada and Australia. Even though China has the second largest economy in the world and 2/3 of Brics' GDP, they account for a measly 2.6% of the global currency reserves. But there's an even bigger problem. As of 2022, China holds the most foreign exchange reserves, set at over $3.2 trillion. Japan is the first runner-up with $1.2 trillion. Meanwhile, the United States holds only $244 billion of foreign exchange reserves. Owning the largest reserve currency comes with exorbitant privileges for the United States, as a former finance minister of France put it in the 60s. This allows the US to issue bonds and pay lower interest rates because the dollar is in such high demand. That means the US is printing money at will and quote-unquote weaponizing the US dollar. But it seems all of that is about to change. Let's imagine that after the end of the Cold War, the Russian ruble became the world's reserve currency. Would the US and Europe simply accept Russian monetary policy? Or would they look to create their own currency that will give it more freedom as they grow detached from the ruble? That was a rhetorical question. Of course they would. So, Russia, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa are doing the exact same thing today. The question of the Brics currency was being discussed by Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping during a May summit in Beijing. As Putin pointed out, the trade turnover between China and Russia in 2023 was worth $227 billion, a 25% increase in just 1 year. And almost all of it was done in either rubles or yuan. And if that wasn't bad enough, during Putin's visit to Beijing, China dumped $53.3 billion worth of US treasuries and agency bonds. And the tides seem to be shifting already. As of Q1 2024, 52% of Chinese payments were settled in RMB, and only 42.8% were settled in US dollars. Parallel to this, China is increasing its gold reserves from 2,235.39 tons to 2,264.87 tons in just 1 quarter. In South Africa, Brazil, and Argentina are starting to allow settlements in RMB, and this trend is being adopted by more and more countries across the globe. Countries are slowly dumping the dollar and settling debts in local currencies, including the members of ASEAN. And India is already trading with Russia in rubles or rupees. While establishing a new Brics currency would be very difficult, the member nations are already working on creating a Brics blockchain-based payment system. According to a March 2024 statement by Yuri Ushakov, a Kremlin aide, the system is referred to as Brics Bridge. The system takes the central bank digital currencies of the member states and facilitates transactions through a single payment gateway. Now, financial experts are still uncertain about the effects of this modern new currency system, but according to a NASDAQ article, any such currency, if stabilized against the dollar, would weaken the power of US sanctions by reducing the influence of the dollar globally, weakening the status of the dollar as a global currency and mitigating risks associated with global volatility due to the lessening of dependence on the dollar. As more countries would seek alternatives to the dollar, this would only accelerate the trend toward de-dollarization. The de-dollarization of BRICS is going to be the central question during the BRICS summit in October 2024. While some argue that the rising BRICS currency is not a strong threat to the US dollar, what is a pressing issue for the dollar is the rapid expansion of BRICS. Since it was first founded under the name BRIC in 2009, there was only one expansion round that came in 2010, when they included South Africa and changed the name to BRICS. For the past 15 years, BRICS has remained a relatively closed group. But when 2024 rolled around, everything changed. At the start of the year, BRICS allowed Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates to join the alliance. And that was just the beginning. Argentina applied for a membership during the 2023 Johannesburg summit. However, when new President Javier Milei came to power, he withdrew Argentina's application, saying that they wanted to reduce